As you know, we are, I'm just going to skip to this one. We have been starting this series about being steadfast in our faith, and Simon kicks it off a couple of weeks. But can anyone remember, and it's the reason I moved that, what steadfast means? Can anyone, we talked about it in a few verses, but I wonder whether you could perhaps talk to the person next to you or the person behind you and think about the last couple of weeks and think about times when you've had to be firm or you've had to do those different things. So little chat with the people, say hello to the person next to you if you don't know them, get to know them a little bit and maybe ask how they've been. Okay, now the passages that, just a little reminder, some of the passages that Simon shared a couple of weeks ago were the one from 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that the Lord you labour for is the work you do for the Lord is not in vain. And James 1:12. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. Simon talked quite a lot about crowns, if you have listened to it, which God has promised to those who love him. Sometimes we can't see how we have persevered until sometimes we look back at what we've done. And what we're planning to do over the next few talks is to look at characters in the Bible, and we are going to be looking at Elijah today. So I just want to start with the context. Some key facts about Elijah. He was from Tishbe in Gilead, and as the different scholars say, that probably meant that he was part of the Manasseh tribe. He was known as God's prophet, and he was sent to challenge Ahab and Jezebel. At the time, prophets were often coming and responding to the way things were happening. And Israel was going through this stage of having a good king and then having a bad king and then having one that was worse than the one before and having one before that. And there's a lot of inconsistency and a lot of turning away from God. And to understand just how Ahab was, we need to actually go back from the passages that we're going to be looking at in 1 Kings 17 and 19. It says in 1 Kings 16, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri began to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria for 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And as if it had been light if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he took for himself, I need to turn the page, his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went to serve Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger all the kings of Israel than had done before him. And that's where we are introduced to Elijah. So, first off, Elijah gets called to go and say something to Ahab. And he warns that there's going to be a drought until he speaks and says otherwise, because the Lord is not happy with worshipping other idols other than him. I have to say, to stand up and say something like that in front of somebody isn't what I would necessarily say something I would like to do. But if that starts to show Elijah's character, it starts to show that he was obedient and he knew that he had to do it. So you can see from a steadfastness point of view, he's probably doing fairly well at the moment. I think God then tells Elijah to go and hide near a brook in Cherith, because that's where he's going to provide for him. I think he took him out of the situation because obviously There's one thing saying that there's going to be a drought from this point onwards, but then as it transpires and a drought actually happens, I think God put him somewhere safe to go through it. And while he was there, I think Elijah learnt to trust more in God, because he had water from the brook, but he received bread through ravens. Now, ravens are a funny way of getting bread, to be honest. Not just the fact that it's a bird bringing it for you, but they were unclean. So God was using something unclean to bring him sustenance. But as time went on, and we know that it was quite a considerable amount of time, we know that this lasted for years, eventually the well dries up. And God says to Elijah to go to a widow in Sidon. Now, he goes, he gets there, he speaks to the widow and asks her to bring him water. He says in verse 10, he says, so he arose and went to Zarephath in Sidon, and when he came to the gates, behold, a widow was gathering sticks. He called to her and said, bring me a little water in a vessel that I might drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, as the Lord God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour and a jar and a little oil in a jug. And I'm now going to gather a couple of sticks that I may go and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat and die. Because the drought is having that much of an effect. And when something happens like a drought, when something calamitous happens, who are always the first people that it's really going to affect? It's going to be the poor, the vulnerable. We're seeing that today. We're seeing that through the cost of living, that actually it's those that actually through the law they should be provided for, don't get it. And yet, God has taken Elijah to a widow. Just like he used a raven, an unlikely source of sustenance, he's now taken him to a widow. As he responds, Elijah says, don't fear, go and do as you said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And she did as Elijah said, and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. So, we've had him show his character and that he's been obedient to God here. He's followed God, what God has said at this point. He has trusted God has provided for him across through to the widow. You can see that you can see quite a bit of Elijah's character. You can see that he is somebody that is trying to be obedient and trust in God. And actually, I think that there's quite a lot going on, because I think God is preparing him for something. And if you know the story, you know that he is. What happens next? The widow's son dies. The widow comes to him and says, you've done this to me, it's you, because she knows he's the one that's also said there's going to be a drought. So she's quite calamitous in the way she responds. And Elijah, in response, goes back to God and goes, God, heal this son, heal her son. And he uses some, I wouldn't say they were particularly, if you looked at safeguarding techniques, I don't think laying on top of a son would be the right thing to do, but he does it nonetheless, and he comes back to life. And we see again God's work through Elijah. And it's at this point that the widow suddenly goes, and now I understand who you are and that you speak the truth. So the fact that she'd been provided for with food up until this point, and we're talking maybe a few years in the way that that's been provided for. I know this is a very short passage, but actually within that span of him saying it to the point that we're going to be coming to, there was about 3.5 years. We're seeing them consistently trusting God every single day. Not too dissimilar to when they left Egypt. And it's at that point where Elijah is told by God to go back to Ahab. On his way, he bumps into this guy called Obadiah. Obadiah has been sent out by Ahab to look for Elijah and hasn't been able to find him. And when he sees Elijah, he's really good. But Obadiah was also feared the Lord and actually helped protect and keep other prophets of the Lord safe. He kept them in caves. He'd made sure they had food and everything else as well. So Obadiah was being obedient in his way. But when he's told, when he meets Elijah, Elijah says to him, yeah, can you go and tell Ahab? And he goes, I don't want to go and tell Ahab, because if I go and tell him that I found you, I think he'll probably kill me. And Elijah goes, no, the Lord has said that you need to go and tell him and he'll come and meet me. And it's at that point where we get into probably the bit that we know the most. The bit where Elijah sets a barbecue challenge, a bake-off or a cook-off on Mount Carmel. Okay, maybe not a barbecue, maybe an offering, but there's a challenge. There is a challenge because Ahab has put all of his time and effort into worshipping Baal, and actually God's got something to say about that. So he sets the challenge in front of the whole of Israel. So I don't reckon that every person in Israel turned up for the challenge, but I would say quite a few people did. They came to see what was going on, and they had this challenge. They had this challenge of both making offerings and seeing whose God would set it on fire. Okay. We know God works in fire. The Israelites will have known that God has come down in fire a number of times. Let's see if Baal can do it. So they go first. They start jumping. They make their offering. They do that. They start jumping around and worshipping. After about 3 or 4 hours, they're a bit tired and they're not jumping around as much. And it's at this point that Elijah starts mocking them. He starts going, "What, are you tired? He goes, is your God relieving himself? Is he on the loo? Has he gone for a walk somewhere and he can't hear you? Or is he asleep?" And of course, that really riles them up. So they then go to the next level of worship. You know, they start raising their hands now. They start cutting themselves. They start using swords and lances to cut themselves. But as we know, nothing happened. Then it's Elijah's turn. He rebuilds the altar at the bottom of Mount Carmel where they are. And he digs a trench around it. He sets it all up. He then asks for them to get water. Now, this is 3.5 years into a drought. Getting water and pouring it in such a way over an offering was probably quite hard because they didn't have water to spare. Well, Ahab had water to spare, and that's where it probably came from. And let's remember that Baal is the god of what? Water. God of rain. He's the God of all these different things. So he's put water and he's completely drenched it. And then he just says, Lord, come do your thing. And within an instant, the whole thing is fried better than the barbecue that I could ever make. It's completely evaporated. All the water in the trench has gone. Everything, not just the offering, but all the wood there has gone completely. And it causes a response in Israel, which ends up with the 450 Baal prophets being killed. At this point, you'd think Elijah was probably at the top of his game. He probably had a lot of confidence, and he probably felt that he was doing what God had wanted him to do. It's at this point that Elijah also, whilst goes to the top of the mountain and asks his servant to start looking out across the sea. Asks him 7 times to look across. On the 7th time he goes, there's a cloud. And he tells Ahab that there's rain coming. Get on your chariot and get home quick, because if you don't, you're going to get caught in a flood, sort of response. A bit like we've had this week. But the bit that I'd never really picked up on was the next piece, where it says, and then God enabled Elijah to run ahead of the chariot to get there before Ahab. So not only has Elijah done these things, done these miracles, and has shown people who God is, he's now got Guinness Book of award for being able to beat a chariot in a race of so many miles or whatever. And again, he's at this place where God has used him and is using him. And then he gets a death threat from Jezebel. And suddenly he shifts. He shifts from being this person that actually, what has he got to fear? He knows that God is with him and God has done all these different things, and he runs away. He hides under a bush, and he wants God just to take his life. He says, I'm no better than anybody else. Just take me. He's gone from here to here. And God sends an angel to give him food. Doesn't talk to him at that point. He just gives him food. He eats the food. He goes to sleep. Does it again. And this time he says, you've got a journey ahead of you. And at that point is when God speaks to him. He speaks to him and he talks to him about who's with him. And we know that what happens in that passage is that there's a big storm, but God is saying to him, I'm gonna be with you. You're gonna see me come. And Elijah's in a cave, and there's a big storm. Doesn't see him in that. There's a wind. Doesn't see him in that. There's a quiet whisper. And suddenly he realizes God is there. And I want us to unpack that a little bit in a second, but I've got a little challenge for you, okay? We've got this thing called a Steadfastometer. And what I would like you to do is talk to the people next to you, look at the different things that happened in Elijah's life, and if there was a line showing how he was, what would it look like? At each different point, I've talked about it a little bit, but I would like you to talk amongst yourselves about at what points do you think he was high, low, how you would have responded in that bit of time. But just think about it, and then we're gonna do a bit of plotting with the red line in a second. So talk amongst yourselves. Talk about what we've spoken about so far. How do you think he would have been in that period? Would he be high? Would he be low? How would it have changed? Off you go. Okay, bit of audience participation here now. I have my dot. As we're going along, you need to tell me higher or lower. Okay, so he's at this point here. Higher or lower? High. Okay. Keeps going. He's at the brook. Higher or lower? Still high. Okay. God instructs him to go to the widow. High? Yeah. Elijah is told that the widow's son is dead and he brings him back to life. Would it have been a bit of a low and then a high, or would it have been high? You reckon low? You're going to be lower, okay. And then he's told to go back to Elijah. Go to Ahab even, yeah. Okay, that's roughly what I thought it would slowly be. That's what I sort of might try to make a prediction. On the next one, this is obviously, we start at this point here, the barbecue or the offering and the challenge. Where is he? High here? Higher? Weather warning, higher? Death threat? Low. Low. And what about when God sends the angel? Still low or getting higher? Okay. And then when God speaks to him here? High. So that's what I sort of put it like as well. The point I'm trying to make is it wasn't constant. It wasn't one thing the whole time. It wasn't that it was constantly high. It was life brings its challenges. And sometimes they make you can feel like you're on top, and sometimes you can feel like you're at the bottom. And it's how we respond at those times, but more importantly, how God responds in those times that we need to hold on to. Some key points. Elijah learned to trust God throughout the drought. He provided for him in a daily way, and as he did so, he trusted in him more. That built up to the point that when God asked him to step out at Mount Carmel, he was able to step out. And he trusted what God told him to do. Problem is, he was trusting in God. He was looking at God. The second he got that death threat, he began to experience fear, doubt, and depression. Those things in himself, which we all carry, which we all have, which when Peter took his eyes off Jesus when he was walking on the water, what happened? He sank. We all go through those points. We all go through that. But it's the fact that God responds. It's the fact that God gave him what he needed at that time. Starts off by giving him bread, stuff that build him up physically before he actually reveals himself and helps Elijah to see where his identity is. And it's in him. And I think that's something that we can all learn from and recognise. I was looking at this, and as I was thinking about it this morning before I came in, what journey did the widow go on? She was hopeless. Elijah came and started to bring hope. And then, whilst she was having that provision, it wasn't until God did something significant when her son died that she truly understood who Elijah was and truly recognised God. And I think we can do that sometimes. We can look back and see that actually God has provided for us and provides for us on a daily basis. But when we're in the middle of it, when we're focusing on our fear, when depression comes because you can't see a way out of things, it's when we recognise that when we look to God and we trust in him and we look to him and we recognise where our identity is and we hold on to the promises that we know God has said over us. And as Simon pointed out, it talks about he sees us as his handiwork. The actual word is nearer to masterpiece than it is handiwork in the in the Hebrew and Greek. That we are his masterpiece. Not just a knockoff copy, but the masterpiece that he wants us to then go and reflect him in. When we recognise those things, we recognise who we are and recognise our role in encouraging. God sent an angel. I know there's been times in my life when I've been going through some tough stuff and God has sent me somebody who helps me, who acts like an angel. And that's what he calls all of us to be to each other. That's what he calls each of us to be to those around us. We need to understand and know each other enough when we need to be that person. And we need to be close enough to God that when he says go and do something, that we go and do it. I don't know where you are today. I don't know how you felt before you came here, but you might be in one of those stages. Perhaps you feel like God is really calling you to go out and help somebody, to go out and be his hands and feet, to show that love. Perhaps you're at a point where actually all you can see is pain and fear and hopelessness. As we said at the beginning, when we look at Jesus, we have hope. How can we be hope to each other? By reflecting him. We're going to have a time of response. We're going to sing a song. And as we do so, I'd ask that you would just be open to God and recognise where you perhaps feel you are at this moment in time. And if you want prayer, then we will pray, and we'll have time of prayer as well. But it starts off with us recognising where our identity is. It starts off recognising that actually we have a loving Father that wants us to just be strong in him. So let's sing together.